Hi, I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy, and welcome to Infinite Loops. Sometimes we get caught up in what feel like infinite loops when trying to figure things out. Markets go up and down, research is presented and then refuted, and we find ourselves right back where we started. The goal of this podcast is to learn how we can reset our thinking on issues that hopefully leaves us with a better understanding as to why we think the way we think and how we might be able to change that to avoid going in infinite loops of thought. We hope to offer our listeners a fresh perspective on a variety of issues and look at them through a multifaceted lens, including history, philosophy, art, science, linguistics, and yes, also through quantitative analysis. And through these discussions, help you not only become a better investor, but also become a more nuanced thinker. With each episode, we hope to bring you along with us as we learn together. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode of Infinite Loops.
Jim O'Shaughnessy is Chairman and Co-Chief Investment Officer of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, where Jamie Catherwood is an associate. All opinions expressed by Jim, Jamie, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops in 2022. Happy New Year, everyone. I am delighted to have my friend Frederick Gieschen on. He is the proprietor of Neckar's Insecurity analysis. Frederick, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. I really appreciate it.
So I love your newsletter, as you know. I actually do read every one of them, find them really interesting. And you and I have had conversations or texts back and forth, so we know each other pretty well. But you sent me this earlier, and my first question really does have to be about your choice of art. Behind you is a lovely, which I find lovely, picture of Mr. Patrick Bateman. And for kids who don't get that reference, Mr. Patrick Bateman was a Wall Streeter who also had a side hobby of being a serial killer. So, Frederick, I don't want to play Dr. Freud or Dr. Jung here, but explain.
Yeah, so I was actually advised by a friend that the picture is too intense as a background. However, it's too big for me to just put it somewhere else. This apartment is not that big and it's too big to cover up. So I thought, let's just go with it. To me, this wasn't on the wall for a few years, but it's back up for two reasons. One is I really relate to a scene in the movie where Bateman sits in the back of the cab with his fiance. And the fiance says, we should just get married now. We should just finally do it. And he says, no, I can't do it. I can't take time off work. And the fiance goes, well, you don't even like that job and you don't need the money. Why do you care so much? And what does he say? Because I want to fit in. And for many years, I really related to that. I was that person who wanted to fit in. And I thought, if I just put on the right suit and the right tie and learn the jargon in the right firm, I hang out with the right people, I could mold myself into the person that I thought I should be, like a really good analyst or deal maker or portfolio manager, what have you. I had sort of this desire to sort of be somebody else. That didn't work, but still the line and this disconnect of the person behind that face in the outside world, that stuck with me. And frankly, now there's another reason why it's up, which is just, I don't know if you can tell, but it's sort of this silent scream. He's sort of in that painting and I can hear the painting. I can hear, it's very audible to me. I can hear that scream. And there is that theme of him being in that void, in pain. His way to channel that is violence. And that's part of the movie. And I guess it's a little bit unfortunate and maybe triggering to some people or who just have really bad associations with the movie. But to me, it's very relatable to think of him as you're sort of trapped in there. You're the observer. You sort of have to figure out a way to relate to this world that you may feel disconnected from and where you feel like, what is my way to connect my essence with the world? How do I fit in? And if you don't, it does become, at least for me, there is that terror of like, is that ever going to resolve itself? Right now, that's still sort of a reflection of my mood at some point. It might be that the painting at some point will find its way to a quieter place and not sit right behind me. But right now, it's still up. And it does also relate to the newsletter in a way, because I think I finally found, after sort of a decade of different jobs where, like I said, I try to fit in, I try to be somebody who I wasn't, and I never really excelled. I just had this sequence of trying and it wasn't working. And I still held on to it. Now I finally, I think, found something that really resonates, where I know on a deep level, it's not always great, it's not always fun, but sometimes it is. And on a very deep level, I know if I just keep going in that direction, I don't know exactly what will happen, but I know it's the right path and I know I'll get somewhere. I just have to keep going, have to keep learning, have to keep trying things out. But on the one hand, there's this deep resonance, and that's great. On the other hand, there is this uncertainty and anxiety of, well, am I going to be able to sustain myself with that? Is there going to be a career and a job in it? It's not something that's very straightforward writing online, even though you've talked about the Great Reshuffle, and I agree with you, but I think there's nuance to that. It's not always as clear.
Very true. And as I was preparing for our conversation, the connections that weave their way through, and we're going to get to it later. One of your pieces named, I think, 3, maybe 4 people who I'd had on the podcast as guests. And I was very struck by that. The one that's up right now is the one with Tom Morgan, in which we talk about the real importance of following the art, follow the artists. What you just said resonates with me, even though we are really different people. It resonates with me on several levels. The first one being, yeah, you're doing the right thing. You're becoming aware of your situation and your surroundings. That's the way to break the feeling of that Patrick Bateman. He hasn't done that. And so he almost feels like he has locked in syndrome. And his release is murdering people until we get to the end, where we really don't know if this is all just a big fantasy. So I read the book and I saw the movie. I use the GIF all the time. I use it ironically because I want to fit in. But to me, what you said really resonates because A, you're following the art, which I think people absolutely have to do. B, you said something else which really struck me, which is you are now looking for the flow. And for all of my life, since I was 18, Taoism has been very important to me. The idea of flow is so central to the thesis of Taoism. I say that and then I laugh because there is no thesis of Taoism. Not really. I mean, it's like Jed McKenna says, you don't want to get a PhD in waking up. You want to wake up, you stupid fucker. You and I had a text exchange, though, and I had sent you something from Howard Bloom's Global Brain. And it was about this idea about what he calls Faustian introverts. And what I read again that I hope that you took in was they are the ones who often achieve incredible things. Because unlike extroverts who like the shiny things, they kind of rush to the shiny thing. Introverts, it's very well documented that they can apply themselves in ways and with focus that a lot of extroverts really have to train themselves to do. Like I literally had to do that. Sat alone in a room for 3 years, dreaming up what works on Wall Street and invest like the best. But what's cool about that is that we're living in a world now where everything is in public. I think it's great. You did a piece called The Rise of the Media First Investors. And I noted to you, well, cool story, bro, but that's the way it's always been with guys like Marty Zweig, with David Dreaman, me.
Right. I can't believe I forgot you in the piece. It was staring me right in the face. And as soon as you DM'd me, I thought, no, there's no way.
No. But you have Patrick O'Shaughnessy, who's my son, in there. So as long as you get one O'Shaughnessy in there, we're cool with it.
Right.
But one of the things that I wanted to talk about and get your opinion on is back when I had to do it, it was different because we had gatekeepers. Back then, you wanted anyone to notice you at all, you had to be an expert on something. And really, the only way to be an expert, and I can't remember whose quote it was, but it was like, if you really want to learn a subject, write a book about it. And so I got this bright idea, I'm going to write a book. My far more practical wife was like, you do realize that you're going to have to get a publisher, right, Jim? And you got to do that, or we had to do that. And then mention CNBC. I got a lot of benefits from early CNBC. It's changed dramatically, and I haven't watched TV in maybe 10 years, but that kind of TV. I would argue, and I think I noted this in my DM to you, that the people doing it today, it could be arguably scarier. And scarier because the way it's done today is basically learning in public, failures and all, mistakes and all, which I think if you're doing it the right way, it's fantastic because mistakes are opportunities to learn. But your audience, maybe they don't know that. Talk to me about writing that piece, then how you fit in.
I totally agree with you. The way this piece came to me is I saw this podcaster, Harry Stebbings, who does 20 VC, which is a popular venture capital and technology podcast. Terrific, very young though. And he raised a very substantial venture capital fund. And I saw that and I thought, wait a second. My first instinct was just, oh, this is bull market and everybody's just giving out money. This is just a sign of the times. And then I thought about it a little bit and thought, no, this actually makes perfect sense for several reasons. First of all, having a podcast or writing a book or having any of those ways to create an audience is the perfect pre-sale to raise a fund or raise any kind of capital because people trust you, they see you as an authority, they like you. So it's natural that that kind of transition would happen. But also, at least in venture, there are tangible things you can do with that audience and with that asset to improve, to source deals, to also improve the outcomes in the portfolio by helping your companies get the message out, shape the narrative, hire, find more capital. I think to your point about the gatekeepers, I can see how it used to be very different in that in order to be seen as an authority, you needed to get the book out. And there's all these steps that you have to go through. Today, I think you fight a very different obstacle, which is this infinite wall of noise or information. Getting attention is the battle. Anybody can start a podcast, but there's only one 20 VC. There's only one Invest Like the Best. There's only one Infinite Loop. So there's a long tail of people who would like to participate that and just can't poke through the noise. I do think it creates a lot of opportunity. In terms of the risk, I struggle with that. I can see what you're saying. I think, yes, if you fail publicly, that's I guess worse than failing privately and failing in general, if you can avoid it, you try to do that. But I think we overestimate the cost of failure. First of all, I think the internet, for the most part, unless it's really memeable, forgets very quickly. People just move on and there's something new happening every day, every week. What you might find is you might find yourself with people who are envious of your success and who become public detractors. I think that does happen, whether you call it trolls or something else. You might have specific people who will keep pointing out your failure. But I think in general, at least the way I feel about it and the way I've seen it on Twitter is I think people are in general somewhat forgiving of failure, unless you're stealing or you're doing something that's obviously wrong. But if you had the best intentions and people follow along in your journey, my hope is that people are forgiving and that it overall creates a better culture to try things out. So what I thought was the theme of the piece was this is sort of different at scale. It's much easier because there aren't these gatekeepers to do this, but it's not new, like you pointed out. And I think it dates back all the way to A.W. Jones, who raised the first hedge fund after he wrote a magazine piece on market forecasting and then found that making money in journalism is not that easy. And why not use these insights to raise some money and start the first modern hedge fund? And then other people like Carl Icahn or Ray Dalio, there's a long line of people who used writing or content to get into the business. Michael Moritz at Sequoia is another great example of a journalist. But to me, they still felt one-off. This person establishes themselves as an authority in their own way, but it felt a little bit like a rarity. Now it seems to me like there is a shift where this is becoming more commonplace, at least on the technology and venture side.
It actually bleeds into the other piece that I have several that I want to talk about, but the reading obsession, which I think was one of your more popular pieces. And it was about Buffett and the mythology that Buffett has created himself. I have mad respect for Buffett. I really do. But I like the real Buffett as opposed to the ukulele playing grandpa who says that he lives in what we would call flyover land here in New York. Hey, I grew up in flyover land. And he does, by the way. He does live there, but he's got other places and New York City and so on. And one of the things that you mentioned that I completely agree with is the idea of the value of the network. I had a couple of things that I thought about and wanted to get your take on, because I think that success, both earlier and today, is a bit what, like my friend Roy Sutherland calls, the value is not in the thing, it is in the perceiver's perception of the thing. I've been doing a ton of research into complex adaptive learning systems. And what just keeps popping up again and again and again is people, and we could call them nodes, they achieve a place in the collective unconscious, as Jung would call it, or in the zeitgeist or whatever, and they snap up real estate in everyone's mind. But that gets to the other part that people really don't like to talk about complex adaptive learning systems, is this idea of the Matthew effect. That's from the Bible. I'm not really a biblical guy, but I looked it up because I heard it so much. And it's from he who hath, much more will be given. From he who hath not, what little he hath shall be taken. That is a description of watching an AI, complex adaptive learning system, work. In other words, the nodes that are getting it right attract all of the other nodes. And this node over here that isn't getting it right dies. What's really interesting, to me at least, is that it actually also happens in real life, apoptosis, which is cell death. I didn't know that our cells were programmed to commit hara-kiri if they weren't doing any good, but they were. And so you start looking and you start seeing, if you start studying biological systems, guess what? They do it exactly the same way. And finally, I'm fascinated by the value of networks just in general, because your network is your filter. That's not original with me. I think that's Don Tapscott. But you think about Basquiat, the artist. I love art and collect art. Most people don't know that Basquiat was part of a partnership called SAMO, S-A-M-O. He and his friend, Al Diaz, did all of the original graffiti artwork. And people of the time who knew them well said you could not distinguish between their work. Literally, you could not know if Basquiat did it or whether Al Diaz did it. Well, Basquiat decided to plug himself into the network. Andy Warhol, the whole deal, became, as we know, and tragically died young, but became incredibly famous. Al Diaz, who you could not tell the difference between his work and Basquiat's work, did not plug in.
Yeah, that's a great example. You're right. I think it was the single most popular piece that I wrote, which is very ironic because it's just effort and input and sort of the amount of work you do correlates in no shape or form with how popular something is. And I thought maybe I should just write more about Warren Buffett. Maybe that's just what the people like. But I really liked the piece because it hit on a few things that I was thinking about. And the first thing is this mythology, as you mentioned, around people like Buffett or pretty much anybody else who is successful. That narrative or that mythology is often shaped by that person. There's a book called From Predators to Icons, which deals a little bit with that. And the thesis is that the people who we look at as icons were often predators or just very different early in their career. And later, once they become successful, they sort of obfuscate or change that origin story and make it more palatable, more exciting, more bootstrapped. There's two things that work. One is look at what they say versus what they do. And I think there are just so many quotes from value investors about the value of reading. It just struck me that people who collected those, and there's like dozens of pages of just everybody says you have to read all the time. And granted, I enjoy reading. I want to have readers. Reading is fantastic. Yes, it is how we build knowledge. But if you take it to this cartoonish extreme of I'm going to outread my competition, and reading is all I'm going to do, and that's how I'm going to be successful, then I think you'll get very lopsided and just completely miss the other parts that made Buffett or anybody else successful. And that gets to the other point, which is you have to look at somebody in the context of the stage of their career. And looking at Buffett today, having 30,000 people attending the annual meeting, at least before COVID, that's a very different Buffett with very different constraints and goals and opportunities than young Buffett, who started out and yes, who read all the time, but who also constantly, proactively went out into the world and engaged with people, asked them questions, built networks, found the right people. And he did it in his own way. He didn't go to a conference and give everybody his business card. He had his bridge players, or he had a group of investors, sort of the Grahamites, which turned into the Buffett group that he went on vacations with, and they had speeches and everything. The best example was how he found Geico, where his mentor, Ben Graham, had been on the board. And it's not like he spent an entire year just reading the annual reports and reading all the filings. He got some baseline knowledge, and then he went to the Geico office on a Saturday and knocked on the door and said, "Is there somebody here who can explain this business to me? I don't really get it, but there's probably somebody there who can teach me." And that happened. He found somebody who kind of explained the core of the business model, the cost advantage and the advantage in the underwriting by focusing sort of a lower risk group. That model, I've never seen those annual reports. I'm not sure if it's obvious, but it wasn't obvious to Buffett, and he had to find this teacher figure. And I think for a long time in my own career, I really underestimated the value of the network. It was not something that I cultivated and built in the way that I thought. And I think part of it was because, to go back to sort of this earlier point, is like you have to sort of find resonance and you have to find people that you connect with. And I think just going around, quote unquote, networking for the sake of doing it is ridiculous. Nobody wants that. It's transactional. So you have to find people where you can bond over the same interests, the same ideas, just explore the same curiosity or whatever it is that you enjoy. And that, for me, at least in a professional sense, I don't think it really happened until Twitter, until I became active in sharing. To the point of learning in public, I think one of the biggest benefits for me was just with learning in public and with publishing, you sort of get access to more and more layers of people, and the serendipity of somebody sending you an email back and saying, "Oh, I love this piece. I've been thinking about the same question. What do you think about this?" And these are often people you would just never meet in real life, so to speak, although I think that distinction is sort of obsolete at this point. I don't know if you want to talk about it. The other piece I had on networks, which is me trying to figure out how can I learn this, was Michael Milken. I guess, yeah, it's a little bit of a controversial figure, but to me was sort of the embodiment of somebody who didn't think about it or didn't do it the way I perceive it as networking, but building an ecosystem. He's famous for building up the asset class of high yield debt and enabling entire industries were built on that, like cable and casinos and other telecom businesses. And I think the genius for him was he sort of found this vacant lot. There was some empty space, there were some weeds growing, but like not much was happening. And if he could only add liquidity, if he could make things tradable and transactional by taking inventory and by knowing all the players in the space and by becoming sort of the central repository of all the data, laid the groundwork of becoming that central node. And then he started adding both sides of the network, both the investors, the insurance companies, the mutual funds, and people was kind of entrepreneurs that he overfunded. And on the other side, the deal makers, he put sort of these seeds into the ground, right? He found Steve Wynn, who wanted to build a casino but didn't have the capital. So, well, I'm going to fund that person and I'm going to grow with him as he does bigger and bigger deals. And so I think he was, for me, it's the best example of somebody who benefited by creating this garden where everybody around him also kind of flourished and he helped everybody, but he remained in the center and was able then both as a trader and as an investor to take a cut of that. And it came together for me because he went to prison, was released, had cancer, prostate cancer, and beat that. And in the process, sort of replicated that entire process, building an ecosystem, but in healthcare. Again, he found all the doctors, all the hospitals, and he created sort of liquidity around ideas. He was like, I'm going to fund. He rechanneled his philanthropic effort towards cancer, but with the condition that, well, if I'm going to fund you, I want you all to share ideas. I want you all to go to the same conference, just like he'd had the Predators Ball in high yield debt or in takeovers. He would create that same space, that same ecosystem where everybody could share ideas and get to know each other. And now he has the Milken Global Conference, which is, to me, I just thought such an amount of high quality people for somebody who, as a public figure, at least in the past, was somewhat controversial. How did that happen? And I realized he built his life in such a way that he had all these ecosystems. I haven't met him, but if you met him, I'm sure there's something he could do for you, meaning there's somebody who could introduce you to, or some piece of information or something that where he could add value to your life because he's so embedded in these different ecosystems. And I think I'm never going to be like him, but there were sort of very tangible lessons that I draw from that. And there's something here that you can apply in your own life that I completely missed in the past.
Yeah, but one of the things that I do have as a thesis is what you've just described with Michael Milken. The only thing I would add was you need a spark. The spark that he had was his seminal paper showing that so-called junk bonds were no more risky than rated bonds, at least of the lower rating variety, which was, for the time, a seminal piece of work. Nobody knew that. He had this great lightning strike, but then you're absolutely right the way you described the rest of his career. Very, very good at world building. And my thought is that, well, hello, welcome to the next 300 years, if things go right. And that is, we now have this system where I have access to people I would have never met, probably would have never met you. Lily Funkus, who I put on, who got a job in this, but she just was doing it for fun. I would have never met her. Liberty, I mean, I can just keep going on and on and on. And so I think that the leverage inherent in a global intelligence network, which I still think the probabilities are still that Twitter will be that network unless Jack just really fucks it up and Web 3.0 replaces him, which, by the way, you have to list that as a probability, not just a possibility. Now, I think the probabilities are still in Jack's favor, but hello, MySpace. Hello, Ask Jeeves.
It's a field that, I'm sort of an interested observer, and I've gotten my first experience in a DAO, sort of decentralized
autonomous networks, right?
Networks. And it's fascinating, and there's so much enthusiasm, but it's also, you realize how challenging it can be to coordinate people globally, remotely. And sometimes it works amazingly well. And sometimes you realize how important it is to communicate efficiently, and you have to learn each other's styles and the outcomes. I think you'll end up with a very wide range of outcomes, with some things that work just amazingly well, and a lot of things where it gets tried and discarded again. At least in my experience so far has been, it's promising.
I would say that if you study, like I just mentioned, that I've been doing a deep dive on biological systems as learning mechanisms, guess what? That's exactly what happens there too. They try a bunch of different stuff. Most of it doesn't work. Most of it fails. But then they continue to survive because the few that did work worked pretty well. I don't think that we're going to get away from the Pareto distribution. I think power laws do rule. That's the Matthew effect again. It is baked into our very biology. I'm currently reading a book by Howard Bloom where he tries to reimagine capitalism because he makes the correct claim that what all of the other religions and ideologies and whatnot promised, capitalism actually delivered on. In other words, in raising the living standards of the average human being, capitalism is a runaway success. Now, does that mean it does everything right? Of course not. But why I'm reading the book is because he makes the argument that it's built into our DNA and that, yeah, boom and bust, free markets. I'm not done with it yet, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But it is amazing to me that we still need. So what I think, and I think you're a good example of this, actually, and so is Tom Morgan, and so is Liberty, and you can see a pattern here. What's the pattern? The pattern is you all are excellent at distilling and synthesizing knowledge, as you yourself pointed out. So your average person with a job isn't going to be able to read all the things that you read. They're not going to be able to do the deep dives that you do. That makes you very valuable.
There's so much to pick up on here. But first of all, I think we all have the internet. To me, is sort of the best and worst thing ever to happen to curious people, because I have access to so many brilliant minds and so much information. That's fantastic. I also have constant FOMO, fear of missing out, of all that information. I can't keep up. And in fact, because the overall human knowledge is increasing so quickly, my relative knowledge, even if I'm constantly learning, is kind of declining. I have to kind of accept that no matter how much effort I put in, I'm always going to be behind. I was talking to a friend about note-taking apps and these different systems for just capturing everything that we read and then using it to later synthesize and put these different pieces together. And it struck me that the biggest function these note-taking apps have for me is just to soothe my own anxiety of I'm going to collect all these links. I'm going to read all of this later. Don't worry. But I do agree with both the ability to filter and understand what information is actually important and high quality. That's becoming a lot more important. And I just did a deep dive on the letters of the Nomad Investment Partnership, Nicholas Sleep and Zach Zacharia. And they wrote about this as look for the long shelf life insights, right? Try to get away from all the information that decays very quickly. They said basically there should be, just like on food, there's a label with an expiration date on information. I mean, synthesis is interesting because naturally I collect all these ideas and all these different threads, and half of them I'll never be able to follow up on. But it does create a little bit of a tension because I also would like to do something that's original. And so I think sometimes I write something and I'm trying to figure out what is the right balance of incorporating everybody else's work and all these beautiful quotes and thoughts and concepts that you find versus also being present in the piece myself with an opinion, with an original take. Now, having said that, truly original ideas are hard to come by. It doesn't happen that often. And I think that's the other thing I learned from Nick Sleep is when you have a big idea, you have to really pounce on it. And maybe that is the Great Reshuffle. There are these big trends. And in the past, I think I was sometimes negligent when I saw something and said, oh, this is interesting, but here's all these other interesting things. Here's a new shiny thing. And you sort of have to balance that exploration and exploitation, that explore, exploit algorithm of sometimes you have to just focus and really dig deeply and pursue the idea for all it's worth. Sometimes, when something like Web3 or when crypto comes around, sometimes it's worth paying real attention and really understanding it. And other times it's important to have that open mind. And I just wrote a piece about clutter today because I started to realize that it's so easy to not have that open space, to not have any slack and just fill everything up, whether it's bookshelves or calendars, and caught in that busyness.
Yeah, it is the perennial question. I opted to go deep and have a deep domain knowledge on quantitative investing, algorithmic, et cetera, but at the cost of ignoring some of the pattern recognitions that were built into me. I've been doing this a long time, and I worked briefly for Bear Stearns, and I was walking around there telling anyone who would listen to me, if you can short your house, short it, but I didn't do anything about it. And the reason, Frederick, that I didn't do anything about it was because I had so instilled quant rules into myself that I didn't have a quant rule telling me to short real estate. That's kind of my next project, but maybe we'll do it.
Shorting real estate or?
No. No, good try.
Like, wait, that's a new Jim. What did you do with the old Jim?
O'Shaughnessy, shorting real estate. Bobo, you only live once, motherfuckers. Right. No. But it is fascinating because you do have to make the decision. Again, back to flow, what we talked about earlier. I found it easy to do that because I was very aware of my own foibles. I was very aware that I would fall for every one of those behavioral things. Oddly and ironically, the smarter you are, the easier you fall for that stuff.
Because you think you won't?
A, because you think you won't. B, because you don't have any armor on. You think I am so smart that nobody is going to pull anything over on me. No. But then if you are like a connector or you're a node that a lot of people on the network connect to, guess what else you do as a smart person? You come up with the most bulletproof argument for why investment XYZ is going to be right. And you indoctrinate yourself first, you're patient zero, and then you go indoctrinate everyone in your network. I was lucky in that I was very, maybe again, my early adherence to Lao Tzu, but boy, I knew that I was just chicken ready to get plucked. I didn't want that. And I had some experiences selling a put position literally the day before the crash.
1987, you mean, right?
Yep. That was literally my final wake up, you idiot, go the rules base. And by the way, that's not going to be for everybody. Also, I will stipulate there are artists who can do this really, really well. But for me, that was going to be the right path. And back to you and what you're doing, I think, and by the way, I really do read every one of your letters. I often
Thank
retweet
you. I
them
appreciate
too.
it. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. No, the clean slate one I really enjoyed because that was something I tried to be good at for a long time. The long time should clue you in here. My wife can get rid of stuff, Jettison Brothers, I call her when she wants to go clean slate. And I'm not that way. But what I am good at, which you also mentioned in the article and highlight, is you have to unlearn. You lead with a quote from Lao Tzu. That is something that I learned early on that I cannot tell you the value of. The ability to discard opinions that are no longer valid or beliefs. So I go so far as to say, I quote Robert Anton Wilson, who says, I don't have any beliefs, but I have many suspicions.
How you frame the words you apply and how you frame something already makes a difference as to how willing you're going to be to discard that. And I saw all these different parallels. Stephen King wrote this great book on writing, sort of on his own writing process, on his own life. And this sort of line, to kill your darlings, that always stuck with me because I, as a writer, I tend to write somewhat longer pieces. And I always tell myself, no, now you're going to be snappier, punchier. And then what happens? No, I want to include all the details that I found out. I see that struggle in myself of you have to kill your darlings. And so that's a very deliberate process of eliminating things one by one. There's two other ways to go about it. You can either do a deliberate clean slate. For example, Michael Steinhardt, every once in a while, he was just out of touch with the market. And he'd say, you know what? He called up Goldman Sachs and he'd say, I want out of my entire portfolio. I want you to take all the logs.
It's such a baller move, man. Just original gangster.
Yeah, no, just get rid of it all. I'm going to start from scratch. I'm not feeling it. But I could relate to that because I think we've all had those moments where it's like, this is crazy. I need some space. I need some space for new ideas. And I need to get some distance from all the ideas that I bought into and all the positions that I had. And then I think what happens is if you don't do that, I pulled out the example of Louis C.K., who he gave this talk on sort of a memorial for George Carlin. He basically said the early part of his career, he was stuck for 15 years and he was clinging on to material that wasn't working. And he was basically failing and ready to give up. But what else was he going to do? And because George Carlin once explained his own process of discarding all of his material every year so that he could start from scratch and build up something new and have a new special and basically make money, right, with consistently new ideas, triggered him to go through this phase of saying, okay, that's crazy, I can't do it. But what if I did? What if I got rid of everything and started from scratch? And that forced him to go deeper and to look for deeper material. And I think that rebirth can be necessary. If you don't do it, I didn't do that. I just related to it. I was in a career for 10 years where I was also holding on to something that wasn't working. And I didn't have that courage or that insight to say, you know what? This isn't working. I got to figure out something else. And to do that, I first have to remove myself and let go of the situation that isn't working and create that space to really think about something new. So for me, it happened. I was basically stopped out of my position. I drew on the example of Paul Tudor Jones. There's this old fax that somebody once gave me a PDF of. It's a risk manual. And basically what he's saying is if my traders have a position they draw down too much, they're going to be too emotionally invested and messed up. They don't get it. I'm going to send them on vacation and close out this person's positions. That happened to me last year when I basically joined a firm and it was a startup hedge fund. And then I was supposed to help market the firm and help fundraise. And if you know me, that's already a little bit of an interesting proposition that I joined the firm because I had a lot of respect for the people. They were very high quality, but the idea that I was really good at selling and marketing, it was a stretch. And then with COVID, all of that came to a pretty early end. And that was really painful at that point in time because it was just another failure. And I was very frustrated with why couldn't I do a better job or why couldn't I make that thing work? But it took for that vase to break that I could find something else in the shambles, find a new thread that I could pick up on, say, oh, now I have all this space. What am I going to do with that? Well, I'm doing these things on Twitter, maybe just do a little bit more writing. And now no compliance person is going to tap me on the shoulder and say, you can't write about anything that's related to investing. And so I could finally sort of pursue that interest. Again, going back to the painting, both a beautiful journey and it's also a little bit scary because yes, the Great Reshuffle is happening and there's a ton of opportunity. I mean, I think it's wild and this time is different in that sense. It is really different. It's creating a lot of opportunity for people all over the world and it's fantastic, but it's not always trivial. I think sometimes it's hard to predict what exactly will work. And so you have to go through these phases of experimentation and trying things and just seeing what resonates, and then find the overlap between what you personally are good at and interested in and is a market for it. But to get to that point, something else had to break first and release me. And I think if I had been more self-aware, perhaps, I think it's incredibly self-aware that in 1987 you had this loss. And me, I think if I had some puts on and then the crash happens and I'm missing out, I think I would have been pretty frustrated and maybe tried again. So I think it's very self-aware to say, you know what, this isn't working. My human operating system is not designed for this. I'm going to go the rules-based. I think that's very self-aware. And that's a theme that I've been trying to get better at, just having more awareness of what I'm good at and what resonates and what to follow and what to ignore and let go of.
You make several excellent points there. And the one thread that I'd pick up on is I don't know a single successful person who has not had a failure, many times a pretty big one, somewhere in his or her past. In fact, honestly, Frederick, I've been incredibly lucky in the amount of people that I've been able to meet, some really, really big success stories. Honestly, I cannot think of a single person who did not have a huge, in many times, failure, mistake, etc., that everyone has, but it's how you react to that determines whether you're going to be a big success or not, in my opinion. Think of Larry Fink with BlackRock. You know how BlackRock got started?
So I read the story once, but enlighten me.
So Larry Fink was working at First Boston, and he was a trader, and he lost $100 million. They cashiered him that day. Larry, here's your hat. What's your hurry? Get the fuck out of here. Basically, what Larry did was just obsess. What did I do wrong? And that led to Aladdin. That led to him being obsessed with Aladdin, which is a quant, if you will, system. Aladdin stands for Asset Liability Debt Derivative Investment Network. And he opened up a tiny storefront with the first office for the building. And he was obsessed with Aladdin, and look at him now.
This is a story I should dig back into. My goodness. I've forgotten all about this.
Actually, what's funny about that is when I was preparing for you, I'm like, I got to tell Frederick, he should really write about this.
Right. I'm like, this is fantastic.
Honestly, man, with your abilities to dive deep, you could sell this as a screenplay too, I think, because I honestly think it's such a cool story about perseverance, about loss. How would you feel? Whoops, I lost 100 million. They just fired me.
It's also a great illustration of the asymmetry of working at a trading desk at a bank, where you're not personally liable for that. You got a certain amount of upside. If you do well as a trader, you get your bonus. If you do blow up the bank, you're going to get fired, but it's not
terminal for you.
It's not terminal for you. Yeah, that's interesting. So that encourages the wrong kind of risk taking. But to your point about early failure, I think that's absolutely right. And I just digging into Michael Bloomberg again, who was after the merger between Salomon Fibro, I think it was, they let go of a number of partners. And so there he was. Now, granted, he had a nest egg from capitalizing his partnership interest and getting paid out. So it was a failure in one sense, but a comfortable one. But I do think that plays out in a lot of the stories. Kirk Kerkorian is one of my favorite rags to riches story of just somebody who grew up in poverty, and his father had done real estate speculation in California, gone bust in the 20s. Kerkorian dropped out of high school. It was really not a great education, not a great preset for somebody to become really successful. And then he stumbled into flying, learned how to fly, and flew military planes across the Atlantic during the war and got paid. And so he had this tiny nest egg that he could then turn into an airline and then start to build hotels in Vegas. And I was always thinking, like, this guy, he saw his dad blow up. He must be pretty risk averse. My dad was an entrepreneur, and he got successful when he was very young and then lost a lot of it on another venture. And I know what it's like to go through those ups and downs as a family. I thought, that must have really done something to Kirk. No, he used leverage all the time, not in a reckless way, but he constantly put his own name on the line to buy planes or to build something. And he became a master. He still had to earn his scars, right? So he built the biggest hotel in Vegas. He needed European debt to fill up the financing gap. This was sort of pre-Milken. And he really stretched his way to get that international hotel built. And when it opened, he sort of ran into trouble, right? He wanted to sell some stock. The SEC blocked him because he had some run-ins with the mob before that. So there's a whole backstory, but he wasn't able to sell the equity. So he had to sell the hotels, and the Hilton family, rich with cash, they came in and they're like, we're going to take this off your hand at a very favorable price, right? At a fraction of what it had traded at. So he lost out. He built the biggest hotel, lost out on that. And what does he do? Kind of be resentful. I would mosey around. I would be, the world is so unfair. No, what does he do? He just looks right over there. Well, here's the MGM Studios, really undervalued. I'm going to take that over, and then I'm going to use the brand, and I'm going to immediately, again, build the next biggest hotel in Vegas. Boundless enthusiasm for risking it again and dealing with the loss and just saying, okay, this didn't work out or didn't work out as expected. It's a new day. What are we going to do today? I really respect it, and I love it when I find that in a story.
Didn't Churchill say that one part of succeeding is going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm?
That's perfect. Yes.
You and I actually talked a little bit about that, about another issue. I had a great guest, Robert Plowman, on, who is probably the leading genetic behaviorist in the world today. I mean, that's a fraught conversation on so many levels. And he handles it so well, because what if you're on the wrong end of that distribution? Take a step back. If you haven't heard that episode, he makes the claim that there is no other single variable than G, which is general intelligence, that has correlates with virtually everything in terms of outcome, success at outcome, wealth, health, family, you name it. And he makes a somewhat provocative statement that the best thing you did for your kids was creating them, because it's the genes, it's not so much the other. I don't have a huge point of view. I tend to think he's right, just through my own experience. But what I like is he has a great section where we're talking about this, and he goes, you do not have to make the idea that your genes are your destiny your mantra here. Quite the opposite. And he uses himself as an example. He's like, look, I have the pudgy gene. I'm going to have the tendency to get fat. And so that drives my behavior. So he's rather draconian about it. It's like no sweets, no goodies in the house and all that. I am fascinated by this idea. And you and I kind of had conversation about it, about some of the other people that I've met. One of the things we talked about was the idea of an inner judge. Then after like studying about genetics and everything, I came to the conclusion about myself that I was just a lucky person. I was incredibly lucky to get the genetic mix that I got. Because one of the things that I sent you was something I wrote when I was 23 years old. Basically, it was something along the lines of, ever since I was a child, I have thought that I would control and shape my destiny, and that it was inconceivable to me that what I planned for wouldn't happen. And I think I sent that to you because of the David Geffen article.
Yes, that's right.
But we got into a really interesting conversation about, of course, for the chorus, that's going to be, but that is biased by looking only at the successes, right? Okay, yeah, it is. But when you start seeing this trait, when you're lucky enough to be able to meet enough of these people, and you start hearing kind of the same stories, it gets a little interesting. And yes, survivorship bias. If you were going to be a completely rational person, you'd say, well, Jim, you're not going to spend any time with the 99 people who also believe that and failed. You are only going to spend time with the one person who believed that and succeeded.
It might be necessary, but not sufficient, or maybe not necessary, but very helpful. It's still not sufficient. A lot of other things may have to go right too, but it may really help the outcome if you have this unshakable belief that you're going to succeed or you're going to shape your own path and make it happen. I think in those moments when you really doubt the mission or the path that you're on, or you failed and you have to come back for that, I do think that's really important. I love that episode because it was, yes, DNA is important, genes are important. Don't take it as your destiny. It comes back to being aware of who you are, and maybe we can in the future not just be mentally aware, but add data to that and learn a lot more about ourselves and our proclivities. So that's something that I struggled with for a long time, sort of these inner, I don't want to call them inner voices, but there is a system
Then that Patrick Bateman thing might make some of our listeners worry.
Finally it's time to get concerned. But I mean, that inner critical voice that has these different beliefs, and that I think in my case, when things came up like writing, for example, things that would take me into a very different directions, there was just a voice that maybe very harshly discounted that and said, you're never going to make money with that. That's not a real career. And like what helped me a lot is between meditation and reading some of the books that you recommend. And I have a very long reading list after being a listener. One day I will make my way through it, but there are some real gems. And just being aware, meditating, and creating that distance between the observer and the emotions, the thoughts that all come and go, and also those beliefs. Writing maybe it is difficult to make a living of that. That doesn't mean I need to think about that right now. And also, it's not necessarily true to observe everything that's going on and maybe change it. So what I'm less sure about yet is to what extent you can actively shape all of these, the voice or those belief systems. And I think it's possible, but it hasn't been straightforward. If I could get the handle on that, I followed the Thinker Prover thread and did the exercise of writing down all of those. What do you want in life? It was interesting. I came out at a paradox with that. I realized that a lot what I want in life was not really financial success. A lot of it had to do with not having to think about money, doing all the other things that baseline amount of money would be unlocked. But what happened is, because I didn't want to think about money, because I wanted to just have this baseline amount of success, all I thought about was money. I didn't want to worry. And then all I did was worry about my security. It became very big. Instead of minimizing it, it took over my life. And then I wasn't able to even think, could I leave a stable career and do something else? So that was unthinkable. That was so scary. That's an unwritten piece. That's a draft that one day I'll write about that paradox.
Yeah. Don't think about an elephant. Shysters and con artists of the Middle Ages used to sell lead to peasants and guarantee that it would turn to gold if they didn't think about
it. Good luck. Good luck.
Good luck. So the extended part of the Thinker and the Prover is don't go for negatives. Don't say, I don't want to worry about money, but rather I want a career in which I am growing, happy, and making the best use of my talents. That's kind of happened to you, I think. And one of the things that's interesting is that as you, again, now we're back to the Tao a bit here, you got to let go of the tiller. Letting go of the tiller, or as Zorba the Greek would say, boss, you'll never make it because you don't have the courage to let go of the rope and be free. And of course, Zorba is a bodhisattva and a Taoist sage masquerading as a Greek day laborer. Great book if you haven't read it, by Kazantzakis, Zorba the Greek. So that's scary. That's the other part that I think people need to understand, is that it's not that other people don't get scared. They do get scared. The other thing that's cool about this that I have experienced, and I think you will experience, is that as your letter, for example, becomes better known, hopefully people know more about you after listening to this podcast, what happens is a whole new opportunity set opens. And you got to choose. Can't do all of the opportunities. But the fact is that if you have a growth mindset, and I hate because that's a cliche and I try to avoid saying them, but in this instance, it's true. If you have a zero-sum worldview, you're just not going to make it in what you want to do. The point is, the world we're going into is designed for people like you, because you can do the deep work, the deep thinking, and then serve it up through your own interpretation of it to people who are interested but don't have the time.
I certainly hope so. And it feels that way. I wrote about the scarcity versus abundance mindset. I think you're absolutely right, but I think it's not 100% our own choice. I think we get shaped in that mindset by our environment. For example, I think Twitter or the internet at large, the different communities operate according to different mindsets. And if you go into value investing Twitter, and people have been beaten up by the market for a few years, and by design, I think distressed investors are probably the best example, where you have an asset, it goes into chapter 11, and you have people who buy up the debt. to get a piece of the company as it emerges. And that's a zero-sum game. That's a knife fight. And you're fighting with these other people over control and over the value of that asset. That is totally different from being in a community like venture capital or crypto, where at least right now, the opportunity set is pretty substantial and you're all sort of working on this together. And it's much easier to have an abundance mindset if everybody around you is also sort of in this optimistic and cheerful way, thinking they move the same thing forward, versus if you know, for my job, my opportunity is because somebody else is making a mistake. The other thing you said about letting go of the tiller, I don't know if you've watched Dune, but...
Oh, yes, I did. Huge Dune fan.
Yeah, they're in the, what is it called? The ornithopter, right? The tiny helicopter with the wings, and he goes into the sandstorm. So part of his journey, part of his evolution is to let go of the tiller and like finally go with the flow and accept those forces, that force of nature in that case. There's something bigger at work, and I'm not going to be able to control this. I'm going to just have to trust the process here for a moment. And I think that finding that balance when you have to push and go with the ego and actually make something happen, and when you have to be sensitive to the environment and say, okay, no, let's just see where the flow takes us, see what doors open up, and trust that it's going to work out. I think there's a balance there. I can see it. It's not always straightforward, because I think for me, there are often moments when, from an ego perspective, I'm like, no, I want this to work a different way. But with ease, elegance, it's going to be a lot easier. On history, because you mentioned it, what are the lessons of history? And sometimes it feels to me like if you were unaware of history for the last few years, knowing your history in financial markets was kind of inversely correlated with success in the markets, because you just shy away from a lot of these things. So I don't know that I've changed my opinion on that. I mean, I love reading history. I think it's very valuable to be aware of history. But I think, again, it's something where you have to be careful not to draw analogies too directly from history. In 1987, after the crash, there were people who were like, this was exactly like 1929. This was the opening bell. There was too much leverage. And now we're going to see the next Great Depression. And I think the danger is just to affix to these narratives that come out of history. I think you should be aware of history, but then you have to be open to the fact that you have to still do the work today, not get sucked into a story and into something that's like a pretty overlay chart, the way Paul Tudor Jones supposedly predicted the crash, right? Like he was so in tune with the market, he had a good feeling that the market was going to crash and he was short. And he had this overlay chart that compared the market in 1929 with 1987, but that chart had been fudged. It had been made fit. And so that wasn't really the explanation. And if you'd gotten stuck with that explanation, then you would just subsequently miss out on the recovery and the bull market because you're stuck in the wrong mental model. So I've seen a bunch of those stories where people draw a parallel to history and use it to invest that way. And that's, I think, very treacherous.
So I think that's an excellent point, and it's a very nuanced point. You should not get tied to a narrative that has a beginning, middle, and end, and then say that is going to duplicate, like with that chart. What you should do, in my opinion, is you should really try to understand that the driving parts of the story that ends up being written and the narrative that ends up being written is us, we human beings. If you can understand history from the point of view of, I want to better understand human operating system, and would be great if there was a user's manual, and there's not. What I try to do in all these rabbit holes I jump down and the histories, by the way, if you want to become a bestseller, just read a lot of ancient history, because there's so many great stories there. And my friend Tom Morgan would say it's just the hero's journey. It's just all of them are the hero's journey over and over and over again. Anyway, I think your point is well taken. And again, that's why these podcasts are great, because you can make that nuanced point. The chart, Paul Tudor Jones, he lives here in Greenwich. You're absolutely right. Harry Dent, there's another guy. He wrote all the books about demographics, and demographics are destiny, and blah, 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 blah. And I always was really skeptical about that because, well, directionally, you want to know about demographics and the consumption cycle, say, of your average American, and when they're spending their most. And yeah, then it's probably pretty helpful to know these things. But he did the same chart kind of thing. And it worked right up until it stopped working entirely in like 1987. And that was because markets were changing. The underlying systems were allowing for all sorts of different instruments to be traded that never had been in the past. So then he wrote another book, and I'm not going to just bang on Harry Dent here, but then he wrote another book and said, well, yeah, but you got to understand it was the NASDAQ. Everyone was investing in the NASDAQ. It's like Ptolemy, right? If you got to keep doing concentric circles around your astrological charts to keep the Earth at the center of your system, someone like Copernicus is going to come along and say, hey, what about just moving the Earth over here? And all of the elliptical things. If you've ever seen those maps, they're great. With all of, I use them as an example of people being stupid.
It's when you're stuck in a bad explanation and you refuse to discard it and move on. And instead you're adding all these bells and whistles to perpetuate that because you're so invested in the model. And I can't speak to the hero's journey as intelligently as Tom does. I love the concept and you see it all over the place. And I think that's sort of prevalent, right? Like in the Western literature, there is this focus on like the individual as the actor. And I do think that can trip us up when we look at investing or just sort of the world, because we always fall into this, well, no, this person or this country does X, and then the other thing happens, and the story unfolds and it sounds good. It just may have no relation to what will actually happen in reality, but it's easy to create that narrative. And I think there is more the view of looking at all the forces at the system and how they interact, taking the foot off the gas on certainty and saying, I can see this scenario play out because that's how this is aligned, but I don't know. And I'll have to maybe be prepared for different scenarios because it's just impossible. It's impossible to exactly forecast. But that doesn't sell as many books.
Boom. You've just basically described the way I look at the world, at markets, at politics, at everything.
And you sold a lot of books.
I did do that. I'm very good at reframing things. But I want to jump on your thought there because, again, you should write about that because almost no one understands that. Listen. Narrative follows price, not the other way around. We're really good at creating after the fact rationalizations and or really threads. Life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backwards. I think that was Wittgenstein who said that. That's all well and true. But like 3 examples spring to mind. The example of demographics, which we've already covered. Yes, there's an underlying force there that you should probably know something about, but it's not the be all and end all. You bring up investment in Amazon from what investor were you talking about?
Bill Miller?
There? Yeah, Bill Miller. Right.
Yeah.
So I wrote a piece in 1999 called The Internet Contrarian, and which I said 85% of these companies are going to go bankrupt. Even the winners, and I picked Amazon as one, are going to go down 95% in price. Amazon went down 93%, not 95%. But see, again, that was just me listening to the numbers and assigning probabilities. I didn't know, but you also make the great point that I want to underline for everyone listening to this. Frederick has nailed it. Be a systems thinker, be humble, and realize that you don't know the outcome. You don't know. It's a probability. And some probabilities are much higher than others. Like, for example, I don't get worried at night that the sun's not coming up tomorrow, because if it doesn't, well, we'll all be dead anyway, so we won't remember. So yes, there are very high probability events that you can be, in quotes, certain about. But if you start to understand, be a systems thinker, which means lots of different things can happen and change, then understand the currents of history, but understand that it's human beings doing that and driving it. You're too young to have remembered the .com era. You think now is kind of crazy? Oy. Back then, there are a few investments that sound a lot more like religions to me. Now, literally, I wrote a piece called Mistakes Were Made, and yes, by me. After writing that thing about the internet, what did I do? I started an internet company.
Of course we did. It makes perfect sense.
Right. Of course I did that. But the idea of being really humble in the face of data. I don't write a lot of pieces But you're also absolutely right. You haven't found a great way to help people with this. We default to the person who sounds the most certain, and usually they're full of shit. And it's just so challenging because it's in our DNA. I don't think we're ever going to change it because the illusion of control is something that human beings need so much that if they don't have it, the results are catastrophic. They literally either go insane or die.
If they don't feel like they're in control of the outcome or have
Exactly.
influence.
And it's obviously a continuum. But if you get down to a point where you feel that you have no control over anything, that's a really bad place to be.
That sounds really unpleasant. Yeah.
Very unpleasant. It's just part of our human nature. And there's Romanian orphanage studies of animals, baboons, etc., human beings. It's not a good place. But thus, it makes us easy prey for the people who are like, I will 100% guarantee, I'll guarantee it. No, you won't. You really won't.
Yeah, it makes it easier to sell. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the other part of this is you've got to, and I got to be careful the way I use this term, you have to be humble in the face of understanding the limitations of your knowledge. I joke to you that my mom used to tease me when I was a kid. She said, Jim, I think you suffer from a superiority complex. That feeling deep down inside that you're just a little bit better than everyone else. What we call big ego people are actually really fragile ego people. They need continual stroking. And again, my parents were really good at teasing me. My dad would say, after a horrible setback that I'd had, he'd go, I wouldn't worry about it, Jim. You have a remarkably reinflatable ego.
No. It'll come right back. That's hilarious. It's funny though, because in investing, at least in the short term, your returns will further inflate that ego and suggest to you that, yes, you are in fact superior to everyone. And yes, I was too young to really consciously live through the dot-com bubble. But I think it's fascinating. And that's why I wrote the Bill Miller piece, because so Miller figured out through the Santa Fe Institute and other people in his network, again, he didn't do this alone and in the darkness, but he figured out that, wait, there is actually something happening and I should really put in the work to understand these technology companies. And he had a few big wins and was derided by his own tribe of value investors for going that way because those companies are not profitable and what is he doing? And that's not value investing. But the dot-com bubble to me is sort of this really interesting laboratory of confidence where first all the people who are betting on it, all the growth investors, all the momentum investors and the speculators, they're all right. And the value guys look like idiots. Then that thing collapses and all the people who bet on the old economy, suddenly their entire careers got built on just because they started at the right time, had a few years of outperformance when the market declined and looked like geniuses and were rewarded for this reflexive contrarianism. If you're coming out of that environment, are you really going to be willing to learn about Amazon and Facebook 5, 6, 7 years down the road? Well, the internet is still changing the world. And the first iteration, yes, there was a bubble and it collapsed, but the underlying changes continued. And so I think it's very easy to get tripped up in these snapshots where we think we learned the right lesson. The bubble collapsed and I'm still standing. A few years later, you have to reassess and reevaluate, and those lessons can get outdated pretty quickly. And so that's why I try to hone in on some of those stories from that era, because I feel like it's not always easy to have success, but it is in times easy to have success and still learn sort of the wrong lesson. And I think that happened in some cases and was only discovered like a decade later when you're still stuck with the same old thinking and stopped learning because you thought your system of the world was just validated and the people on the other side were categorically wrong. And I think that death of curiosity and open-mindedness, that way is doom or lies doom. But I think it's easy to inflate the ego enough that you think like, I don't need to learn anymore. I've got it figured out.
Oh boy. I call that sinking into your own bullshit or beliefs. I really worked very hard to present everything I think about as a thesis or a hypothesis, because beliefs get attached to you emotionally. You make them part of who you are. And that's what causes all of that tribalism. man, I could talk to you because I'm looking at the time and
I have all week. I kept the entire week open just so I could talk to you and whatever you need.
I love it because we didn't get to your thing on Squid Games, which I think is brilliant. And this was the one where I noticed that you mentioned Tom Morgan, Luke Burgess, Liberty, and I think there was one other guy. And I think, what might be fun is to get that group together and just record, because I don't know, I think that's another opportunity for really massive, interesting conversations where you learn a lot, because Tom has very different ideas than me, and you have very different ideas than me. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk, because out of that grows new knowledge. Out of that grows a different perspective. All of the things that we're talking about here, they're hard to get across to people because people won't believe it. I remember talking to a guy who was interested in being in asset management on the portfolio manager side. And I'm like, okay, so I'd seen his Twitter feed, a little sensitive. And I'm like, listen, I'm just going to give you the unvarnished truth. If you do not have the thickest skin in the world, you're not going to make it as a portfolio manager, because you go from hero to idiot, hero, genius, idiot, moron, hero, genius, idiot, moron. If you can't roll with that, sticks and stones may break my bones, but that will never kill me.
That's an interesting topic though, right? And coincidentally, I wrote a piece about people starting a hedge fund. I think it goes back to awareness. And I think there are a lot of people who find themselves in the role of the analyst or somebody working in the industry who would love to be or idolize that position of the portfolio manager, right? The person who's at the helm, taking the risk, navigating the water. I was that person at the beginning of my career. I thought, like, that's obviously where you want to be. Obviously, not everybody should be that person. In fact, probably very, very few people do well in that extreme stress and having to just dealing with constantly that feedback and volatility, at least in the public markets, and having the right temperament for that. I think that's rare, but it may be difficult to accept your own skill set. And maybe you're better at something else, right? Maybe you're better at the analyst job. Maybe you're better at something else entirely. I don't know, but it's hard if you have, I don't know how to describe it, but if you're idolizing something like that, I think then it's very hard to be open to your advice or anybody else's advice. People will tell you, no, you don't understand how hard it is and all of these things you have to do or be to succeed. It's like falling in love a little bit. I think you're just sort of infatuated with that idea or the abstraction of that person. You're sort of, nope, I'm going to try this. And I think in some cases, you just have to learn by experimenting and being taught by life. I'm trying to step into that situation, and I'm wondering if I asked you for advice and I really wanted to be a portfolio manager or a chief investment officer, and then somebody said, no, you don't understand. You seem a little bit on the sensitive side. You'll have to grow much thicker skin. Is that possible, or to what extent could I grow enough thick skin? And also, would I really listen to that, or would I not just say like, he says that, you know what? I really want to do that. What does he know? What does he know about me? I'm still going to do it. And you know what? Honestly, maybe you'd fail at that, or maybe not. You might still feel better for trying. In that situation, I'm just thinking it through. I'm so confused. You're probably right with your advice, but should the person still accept the advice, or should they give it a shot and figure it out for themselves? I've come to the conclusion, I ask my friends a lot more for advice. I've made a lot of progress with being more open and authentic and aware and talking about it too. But also advice, there's a lot of everybody's talking from their own experience. And sometimes you take the advice, but then you have to make your own choice. And sometimes you just have to step into the unknown and grow the thick skin by stepping into that whirlwind. I don't know. It's an interesting conversation to think about. I'm really getting stuck on it.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, it's a great place for us to have to end. I'm going to have you on again because I didn't even get to half of what I wanted to ask you about. What I love about this, though, is that these all end up connecting again to each other. So we're back to Robert Plomin, aren't we? It took me a long time to understand that most people are not built the way I'm built. I am pretty much impervious to extreme volatility and risk. My wife said, hire this cartoonist that we both love at the New Yorker. And I went, okay, why? And she's like, I want it to be a caricature of you and me on a raft. Behind us are the most treacherous waterfalls and rocks and everything. And she said, I want to be on the raft on my back, passed out from worry. And I want you to be looking at me with a big smile on your face saying, well, that was fun.
That was fun, right? But it's true. And I can white knuckle, like, I cannot believe we just did that. This was so risky. Jim, why did you bring me along on this trip? This is insane. How could you still be smiling? Do hire that cartoonist. That sounds like a blast.
Yeah, this has been great. I ask everyone at the end of this, and I know you listen to it, so I know you know what I'm going to ask you. You're emperor of the world for a day. Can't kill anyone, can't put anyone in a re-education camp, but you can incept them. In other words, you can put two ideas in their heads, everyone in the world, and they're going to wake up the next day and think that that was their idea and start behaving or doing things that way. What two do you got for me?
Yeah, I'm going to go small scale and just really from personal experience. So something that's helped me and really transformed my life a lot is, like I said, is just being more vulnerable and sharing more of my own thoughts and feelings and just what's going on with me. And I think that's worked really well for me. And I think that's partially because just the readership or people I put it out in Twitter, for whatever reason, people were very nice about it, but it feels like a risk. And I think for a lot of people, it feels like a risk not worth taking because they worry about not being accepted or ridiculed or whatever. And I think we could all do much better in creating an environment that makes that possible and kind of lowers the risk of that for being vulnerable and authentic and ourselves, and just sort of lower the barrier and pretending less that we've got it all figured out and that you have to be a certain way, and taking the ego out of that a little bit. So I think the idea would be look inward and how can I make it more possible for the people around me, the people I interact with, to be vulnerable and real and not be so judgmental. Actually, that's the second one, which is I think changing is hard. This has kind of been a theme in some of these things, like truly learning and truly being open to new ideas is hard. I used to be closed-minded, and it's been difficult to do that. And there are these exercises, and one of these was the Think-Prover exercise of just actually really examining what you believe and where you picked it up and go layer by layer deeper, kind of strip away some of these things that automatically trigger. No, this is like that. Like, I believe this. This is my framework for how the world works. And really spending time to examine that, to journal about it, discard some of the stuff that's not working or that's sort of tenuous. Just being more open-minded and curious. I think I stopped watching the news for the most part. I think there's a tremendous amount of noise and anger in the world, and it's frustrating. And I think we'd all be much better served if we try to be more open-minded and curious and engage in more dialogue. And I think a lot of that has to do with, again, going inward a little bit and examining how we feel about certain things and lowering the amount of certainty we attach to those beliefs and say, oh, maybe I should listen to the other person and maybe there is something to be learned. For me, that's an ongoing process. And I think if I could get everybody to be a little bit less certain about their own opinion and a little bit more open-minded, I think these are kind of tied at the hip, but I think it's what my journey has been like, and I would definitely pull the trigger on that.
I agree. And I think that would be wonderful to do for the world. Tell us where we can find you.
On Substack at Neckar, that's neckar.substack.com. That's the river that flows through my hometown. You can sit at a beautiful beer garden there. On Twitter, Neckar Value, same thing. At the moment, sort of the main outlets, certainly email and DM are always open and welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Jim. This was fantastic. This was an absolute blast. Really grateful that this was possible.
My pleasure. To be continued. I'm going to have you back on because there's a bunch of other things that I want to ask you about. I think you've got a bright future.